Steve, thank you. Thanks to all the sponsoring entities for putting this on today. I'm glad to be back in Benicia, another town hall. We've done this a number of times. We did the multiple topics over at the high school, if you remember. Great turnout, and probably 400, 500, 600 people there that night. And that night, I noticed and I remarked on the fact that times have changed, because running for this congressional seat, my first time after redistricting, I had a town hall meeting at the Veterans Building, and just about, cat a corner from the high school. And I remarked at that time, boy, have things changed. Because at the Veterans meeting, if you didn't count my staff and the 2 veterans who wandered in thinking it was something else, there were like 7 people there. There is a lot more enthusiasm and a lot more engagement in today's world than there was just a few short years ago. And I want to thank you for that. It is extremely important. It is so important that we be engaged. It's so important that we be enthusiastic. And you have to look no further than the budget that the President just introduced to Congress last week to know how important your involvement is. The idea that we would cut Medicare, that we would cut Medicaid, that we would cut student higher education programs, and for the guy who wants to do infrastructure investment to cut infrastructure funding is just beyond me. And then you look at the priorities, and because that's what a budget's all about. It doesn't matter if it's the county budget, the city of Benicia, or the city of Vallejo, or the budget of the United States of America. A budget is the values and the priorities of the people of that jurisdiction. And I don't believe this budget is reflective of our values nor our principles. And so after all of those cuts come into play, what does he prioritize? A border wall. And we know border walls don't work. We know it's 7th century technology for today's world. That just doesn't, it just doesn't cut it. Incredible increases in the defense budget. And I believe we need to have a strong defense. But when you start giving the Department of Defense more money than they're asking for, something just doesn't make sense. And I think that is a big concern that all of us should have. And then we use this budget, and remember, his budget creates a $1 trillion deficit. And what's that money used for? He wants to make permanent the tax cuts that were put in place on a temporary basis that benefit the wealthiest, the richest 1% in our country. And I think that's wrong as well. So your enthusiasm, your determination, your involvement is more important now than it's ever been. Now, I just want to take a minute to talk about a few things, because some things have changed since the last time we had a town hall meeting. Most notably, we have a new majority in the House of Representatives. And it doesn't take a lot of effort to see what that has done. How are we doing on time? Okay. It doesn't take a lot of effort to see what that has done, because already we've passed legislation, H.R. 1, to deal with more transparency in government, government reform, campaign finance reform, and improvements in people's ability to vote. All top priorities where I come from, and I'm sure that that pertains to you as well. We've also done a bill that I've been working on, and we had a town hall right across the street on this issue, and that's gun violence prevention. 6.5 years I've worked on gun violence prevention. I was made the chairman of the task force on gun violence prevention the week after the tragedy at Sandy Hook. 20 young toddlers murdered, 6 educators murdered. And I've been working on this every day for the last 6.5 years. Anybody want to guess over the course of that 6.5 years when the other guys were in the majority, how many hearings we had on that bill?
0.
Anybody want to guess on how many votes we had on that bill?
0.
You got it. We took control of the House, and I got my pick of a number from 1 to 10 on what number that bill would be. So it's a Speaker's priority issue. I chose 8, H.R. 8, because and I was going to introduce it on the 8th of January, the 8th year anniversary to the day of my colleague Gabby Gifford being shot. I don't know if you followed any of the media coverage on that, but Gabby joined me. She walked down the aisle with me, and we put that, matter of fact, I gave it to her. I said, you put it in the hopper. And she did. We had a 10-hour hearing in the Judiciary Committee. We took a vote on that bill. It passed. It went to the floor, and the next week we passed that bill too. And the next day we passed another gun violence prevention bill that would close what's become known as the Charleston loophole. And if you remember that tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina, where an individual went in, bought a gun, came back in 3 days, because the federal law says that if the background check isn't completed within 3 days, you get the gun anyway. Came back, the background check was not completed. He took the gun, he took it into a house of worship, and he murdered 9 people. So we passed a bill the day after my bill was passed that said you had an extra period of time to make sure that background check was complete. So we're doing some work. We've been having hearings, something that had been absent for the last 6 years. If you think about it, think about this. We passed a tax cut bill. First major tax bill in 30 years. 30 years. Okay, this is back to the audience participation. Anybody want to guess how many hearings we had? Anybody want to guess how many expert witnesses we heard from? You know the story. And it passed, and it's just fraught with problems. And again, it really penalizes working class individuals and hampers their ability to move ahead. Those things have changed. We're having hearings, we're working on these issues, and we want to make sure that we have a government that works for the American people. So I look forward to working with you on these issues and all of the other ones, and I'm just glad to be here tonight, so thank you. Well, thank you very much, and it's a very, very sad day. What happened in both the Netherlands and in New Zealand. And sadly, no one's even talking about Brazil the day before New Zealand, where 10 students were killed. The other sad thing is, the only time gun violence ever seems to be talked about and covered and people get outraged is when there's a mass shooting. And technically a mass shooting is 4 people or more, but it seems that it has to be a huge event like New Zealand, like Parkland, like Sandy Hook. The truth of the matter is, someone is killed by someone using a gun 30 times a day. So 30 people every day are killed by somebody using a gun. Now, if you add accidental shootings and suicide, it jumps up to just about 100 people a day. So in the United States of America, in our country. So that is, I think, a real issue. Cops, we've got one in the back of the room, and thank you for the job that you do keeping us safe. They have to deal with the fallout from that every day. They get up in the morning, they go to work, and they confront people who are bad people, and they run the risk of not coming back. If they have to take someone's life, that's something that they carry with them for the rest of their life. So it's not a good situation at all, and so it's an everyday occurrence, not just every however many days before the next mass shooting, mass massacre. So we need to drill down on this, and we need to be very, very determined that we're going to make a change. As far as white supremacy goes, there should be no tolerance in our country at all for that. And the fact that there's a rise, the fact that there's a rise in white supremacy and the whole hate culture should concern us all, and we should all be doing everything we can to mitigate that problem. And there's some great things going on to do just that. They've got programs in the schools now where if you see something, say hello. If there's a kid who's not taking lunch with other kids over by him or herself during the lunch hour, go talk to them, go see them. And it's not just a gun violence thing, it's everything. I'm sure you all read about this incredible young athlete from Stanford last week who took her own life, who was having some very, very serious problems. And I think we could do a lot better job on that end of it. We have one city in our district that has a program where the schools team up with county mental health. And county mental health teaches students on campus to watch for signs, recognize when there's a problem, try and intercede, and if they're concerned, then they can call that county mental health, and they'll send a mobile unit down to help figure out that problem. We need to make sure that we pass more legislation on the known as the red flag legislation. So if there's a problem, if I know Elizabeth is armed and I'm worried about her doing something to harm herself or somebody else, I can call the police and they can come over and intervene and remove that firearm from their ownership. That's happens here in California now. It's a fairly new law. A bunch of other states are trying to do that. Well, there's no shortage of ideas that people have on how to deal with gun violence. There's probably 100 or more pieces of legislation that have already been introduced in this Congress dealing with the issue of gun violence. Everything from banning bump stocks to putting a magazine capacity, how many shells you can have in a magazine, age limits. I've got some legislation of my own, one to extend the prohibitors. And that refers to someone who is prohibited by law from buying a gun. There's some that aren't included that I think should be. If you're a violent criminal, you should not be able to get a firearm. There's also some mental health legislation. I have a mental health bill. There's probably 30 other ones too that would try and make that system better performing. There's efforts to make sure you get all of the data into the background check system, because how many times have we heard it, where the last one I think was the Air Force guy in Texas who shot up the church, and it turns out that he had a bunch of disqualifiers in his background, but the Air Force didn't get it in. We had one in Illinois the other day where a guy had legally purchased a gun, came to Illinois, they think with the gun, got a gun owner's card, which is the law in Illinois, no problem, and then applied for a concealed carry permit. And it was that review that disclosed that he was prohibited from owning a firearm. Too late, he already had the gun, and he killed a bunch of people. So there's a number of pieces of legislation to deal with that. My bill deals with expanding background checks to ensure that anybody who buys a gun, anybody who's transferred a firearm, goes through a background check to make sure that they're not a danger to themselves or to others, make sure they're not a criminal, make sure that they're not dangerously mentally ill. In regard to selling surplus equipment to local law enforcement, I think we need to be very, very careful with that, and I think you're seeing that across all jurisdictions. I just read an article, there's a town in our district that bought an MRAP, and they needed that like I need an MRAP. And now they're trying to sell it, and nobody wants to buy it. So we need to be very prudent on how that's done. I think it's a different world today than it was when the NRA had pretty much free run of legislative bodies across the country. There are new groups in town now. You have Giffords, you have Everytown, you have Mayors Against Illegal Drugs, Moms Demand Action. Who else? There's a ton of them. I was in Pennsylvania talking on this issue on my way home this weekend, and there were 3 new groups there that work exclusively in Pennsylvania. But big grassroots groups, they do everything from go door to door to do marches, such as you did, to raise money to fund candidates who are better on the issue of gun violence prevention. So it's a whole different world. If you look at just what Bloomberg and Giffords did, they changed the political landscape across the country. And if you look at the switch in the House majority, the 40 seats that flipped, just about every one of those, gun violence prevention was part of that campaign. So that tells you something. That tells you that no longer is there one organization saying any law against a gun is, on the road to taking all your guns away. Most people know that that's malarkey. Most people know that it was especially confirmed when the Supreme Court ruled on Heller versus the District of Columbia, where they said you have an absolute right to own a firearm. That's the Second Amendment. But the government also has a right to regulate that firearm ownership. So it's a new ballgame, and I think we still have a ways to go, but I don't think that people who understand the importance of gun violence prevention have to worry about one group in the arena sucking all the oxygen out. I think Steve hit the nail on the head. We're beyond arguing whether or not climate change is real. The overwhelming majority of the scientific community understands it. There's complete agreement on the concerns that face us. You don't have to look much further than the 5th Congressional District if you need further evidence. How many sections of Highway 37 are slated to go into water? 5 or 4? 5 sections of Highway 37 are expected to go underwater because of the rise of sea level. You don't have to look any further than a little further north in our district. Talk to an ag commissioner in Napa or Sonoma or Lake County. Go up, same thing in Mendocino County. Ask them how many new insects are coming into our area on a very regular basis. There's concerns. Talk to the Napa Valley vintners who just came back from participating in a climate change seminar overseas, because the folks who grow our fruit, and in this case our grapes, understand that when the climate changes, so does their business model, so does the product that they grow and sell. And if you're still not convinced, all you have to do is talk to anybody in the chain of command in our intelligence community or in our military. This is a full-scale review with them. They understand what Steve just said. You start displacing populations around the world, that means one thing. It means war. And there's not a war any place on the face of this planet that we don't get sucked into one way or another. So this is serious stuff. And what the reason that I co-authored, original co-author of the Green New Deal, not because it provides a program or it does funding in another area, it is an aspirational piece of legislation. And I'm one who believes that if you disregard aspiration for the sake of apathy, you're in trouble. And we need to make sure that we're laser focused on everything that we can possibly do to mitigate the issue of climate change. So I think this, I think the Green New Deal puts a focus on it. Do I think that we're going to tear down every building and rebuild it? No. Do I think we're going to get rid of every car, train, boat, and airplane? No. but we need to double our effort, triple our effort, quadruple our effort to make sure we deal with this. And we've received setbacks. In the last 2 years, we've had setbacks. We have an administration who, for all practical purposes, are climate deniers. And they've repealed regulation. And they're continuing to repeal regulation that puts us, I think, in harm's way. So that's why I'm a co-author of that. And I think that, combined with the fact that Speaker Nancy Pelosi created the Climate Change Caucus, or committee, is real important. So we can actually drill down and we can look at the issues that are related to climate change. You know, it was just in the last Congress when on Capitol Hill, the Science Committee on Capitol Hill was known as the Unscience Committee. They would argue with experts that came up. You don't know what you're talking about. You may be the brightest climate scientist in the world, but believe me, I was talking to my neighbor Ralph, and he says, and those days are gone. It's an open, transparent process where expert testimony will get an opportunity to be heard. This is not my first rodeo. I didn't have to wait till the Green New Deal resolution came about, and I think you know this. I think we talked about it. I've been doing environmental work for a long time in elective office. Most of all of the renewable energy tax provisions are my bills from past years. Conservation easement legislation, the one, and especially the last one that made conservation easements permanent tax policy, my legislation. If you look at, and I think everybody understands the value of conservation, land conservation, and what that contributes to the environment. And I'm almost at the point, if you don't count my work on the Migratory Bird Commission. If you just look at my legislative work in both the state Senate and Congress, I'm just barely shy of permanently protecting 1 million acres of property. And so this is something, and Elizabeth will tell you, this is something that's near and dear to me and has been for a long time. So as far as the jobs go, look no further than the tax provisions that I had passed that put people to work on renewable energy. That just huge, from air to bio to solar, or wind, bio, and solar. All of that have created jobs and put people to work. And as far as the trade stuff goes, that's been a big sticking point in all trade policy as long as I've been involved in it. You can cut trade deals with other countries, but you better make sure that they're not adulterating the environment, putting people at risk, and putting our planet to risk. And that needs to be a component of any trade agreements that we sign. First, let me say congratulations to those kids. The student leaders across our country have become more engaged. And Steve talked about it with the Parkland students, and I've worked with them since Parkland happened, and now on the environment. And it was interesting to me because I've heard the critics too, talking about, oh, these kids are being brainwashed in school. Let me tell you, these kids aren't being brainwashed in school. Kids are afraid that their classroom is going to be the next one to get shot up. Kids are afraid that they're going to inherit a world from us that is inhabitable, and they care about their future. And the kids today, these student leaders, are way out ahead of the curve for a lot of us, not me, but a lot of old folks. So I think we need to make sure that we give these kids, a venue, a forum from which they can talk. We need to get involved with our local agencies, and at the city council level, at the board of supervisor level, at the state legislative level. We need to be mindful of, plugged into, and vocal about what we want to see in our community. Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I do not have any social interactions with the Flat Earth Society. Yes, I have Republican colleagues that I work with, and the folks that I work with are not climate deniers, and they're not part of the Flat Earth Society. I'd be happy to speak to that. And because you couched it with, it was global warming, then we changed it to something else, I don't think that qualifies for questionable science. I think the scientists all along said that there's a lot that we don't know. We know that the hots are going to be hotter, the colds are going to be colder, the wet's going to be wetter, the dries are going to be drier. I think that's been all along. I think you've got to really stretch it to suggest that there's a scientific community out there who believes that climate change isn't real.
No, that's not what I said. I said that the cause of it, I'm not denying climate change.
I don't think I said anything about the cause.
Perhaps not the sun, for example.
I don't think I said anything about the cause.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be something that's disputed from now on. But I got to tell you, I'm a country kid. I grew up in the country, and I know when you're out in the middle of nowhere, when you leave the house, the further you get away, the colder it gets. There's a human imprint on climate. Any way you cut it, the more people you cram into an area in this room, empty this room, and it'd be real cool. It's just that's just the way it is. Okay, I'm assuming that you've studied this and you know the answer already. I'm a co-author of the Medicare for All legislation. But having said that, that doesn't mean I think that the good fairies are going to come and bring the money to pay for it. I get the fact that it is very, very expensive to do it. I also get the fact that there's real problems with Medicare for All. If that was our health care policy, it would probably work well for most of the people in this room, because Medicare is a health care policy designed for older people. There are a lot of kids that don't have health care. There are a lot of young people, young working people who don't have access to quality, affordable health care. And I don't know that Medicare is the model that they need. In addition to that, anybody here on Medicare already? Put your hands up, okay? Put your hands up. Okay, now leave your hands up. Okay, if you're on Medicare now and you don't pay for a supplemental insurance, put your hands down. So that many of you don't have another type of insurance that you carry? That's very, very rare, because most Medicare policies require, the policies don't, but the individual who wants health care, it would be required to get some sort of supplemental insurance to go with that. So I say that because that's not the 100% answer. So I'm a co-author of the bill, and again, I want to focus attention on how to make sure that we provide the best possible health care, access to the best possible health care that's affordable and takes care of people's health needs. And that's my strategy. Well, as I say, I'm for access to quality, affordable health care. And I don't know that there's one particular answer to it. And I think you were very articulate in regard to the fact that Medicare for All doesn't fill the need. There's still a supplemental that has to be paid. I was a strong supporter of a public option in the Affordable Care Act, which I think would have got us a lot closer to where we are, to where we need to be than where we are now. And as you know, the public option did not have the votes necessary to pass. Now, since then, that universe of health care has been delivered a pretty crushing blow by this administration, by taking out a bunch of money that's used to help people sign up, to do the advertising, and now this idea of reintroducing the junk insurance policies is, if that happens, if this president is successful in putting the junk policies back on the market, Katie bar the door. It's going to be really, really tough. And you know, that's the one thing that one of the most important things that the Affordable Care Act did, is it set standards on what health care needed to be. A lot of people say, well, I thought I was going to be able to keep my policy, but they took it away. They took it away because it didn't cover you if you were sick or injured. So a lot of people who thought they lost something great had never had to use their insurance policy if they became sick or injured. And now this whole idea of throwing people with pre-existing conditions under the bus, that is just absolutely something that would be tragic for all of us, because if you're my age or you're older, as you know, we are a pre-existing condition. You know, I can't thank you for raising that issue. I'm very familiar with what goes on in the hospital. You may not know, but my wife is a family nurse practitioner. She works at a local hospital. So not only do I hear it from my constituents in the healthcare universe, but I get home and I hear it from my wife at home as well. And you referenced two populations that I think are intricately important to this discussion. Drug abuse, and I'll expand it to be drug and alcohol abuse, and mental health. I got to tell you, aside from climate change, I think that mental health may be the biggest issue that we have to face as a people. If you look around, a great deal of our alcohol abuse and our substance abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, are a function of people who start out or maybe continue to use because they're self-medicating. So if you look at our jails, they're filled with people who are there because of a drug or an alcohol abuse or because of an underlying mental health issue. So I think that as far as where we can put resources that would have the most good on helping people and helping keep our hospital doors open would be to double down on mental health and to double down on drug and alcohol abuse and treatment. When I first got to Congress, the big issue was mental health parity. We fought that issue, making mental health on the same plane as physical health. And that went nowhere for years until we passed the Affordable Care Act. When we passed the Affordable Care Act, mental health parity was in there. And immediately, for the last 8 years, they've been taking money away from it. They've been trying to take mental health out of it. So it never really got a chance to really take off and to produce what it could produce. So mental health is a big issue, and it's one that we should really invest in.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm against unfair taxation, and I'm for income equality. I think it's real important that we're thoughtful and transparent as we go forward trying to unwind this tax code mess that the previous majority got us into. I mentioned earlier that we did the first major piece of tax reform in over 30 years. We did it with no hearings. We did it with no expert witnesses. It was literally written, rewritten, and written again within I think a 51-day period in the proverbial back room. That's not the way you should do any type of major policy, especially one that's apt to be with us for the next 30 years. And this particular piece of legislation benefited the richest people in the country and benefited corporations to a far greater extent than anyone had thought was possible. When the corporate rate was dropped, and everybody on both sides of the aisle have been talking about reducing the corporate rate, and everybody's pretty much in agreement that there needed to be an adjustment in order to keep us on the level playing field with our global competitors. Nobody ever thought it would, or suggested it should go down to 21%. So that was just a big gift to the corporate side. If you remember, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Mnuchin, said, there will be nothing in this tax bill that will benefit someone like me. Not me, like him. And I don't know, but when you drop the top rate from 39 to 37, I think it probably benefits him. He's a billionaire. When you bump the estate tax exemption to $11 million and change, and he has a wife, so double it, $22 million, I don't think it helps anybody in this room. I know it certainly doesn't help me. This is a big benefit for the very richest people in the United States of America. And then the tax, any tax benefit that anybody else is receiving on the individual side of the ledger, that's temporary. So it goes away. And that's why in this budget, the president is trying to make that permanent. So it cost us, the collective us, actually it cost our great-grandchildren, $2.3 trillion to do that tax giveaway to the richest people in the country. That's wrong. I'm one who believes that there's never been a tax cut that's paid for itself. And most tax scholars will tell you that that's accurate. I have never voted for a standalone tax bill that wasn't paid for, to the point where I have talked on the floor of the House against and voted against my own tax bills because the previous majority took the pay for out. I think it's a real mistake trying to borrow money to give a tax cut. It hurts us in immeasurable ways. So my effort right now is to make sure that we have a transparent process by which we can go over not only this tax bill that we're living with today, but any tax proposals, to have a transparent discussion, have public hearings, and hear from the experts. And once that's done, the Ways and Means Committee in the House, upon which I sit, that has the responsibility for writing the tax laws, we will be able to go forward and do our work to figure out how we get to equitable tax policy that's focused on building from the inside out to make sure that working class people get the break and they can lift all the ships. Yeah, I think there's two areas where the federal government can do a lot. One is proper funding for the programs that help in this regard. But from a tax perspective, we need to make sure that the tax laws favor folks who are investing in affordable housing and low-income housing. Some of that was lost in the last tax bill. There's some ideas. I'm working with some folks right now on increasing the tax incentives in the disaster relief that's going to areas in California that were devastated by the fires. And there's some pretty good ideas out there on how that would bring about better investment in low-income and affordable housing. I can't speak for all of my colleagues, but I think I probably can sum it up for most. We understand that the immigration process is broken and it needs to be fixed. And we need to rewrite the immigration laws and we need to make sure that it's comprehensive reform. And I believe it needs to include a pathway to citizenship. Now, we all know that that's not going to happen in this Congress. I'm sure we could pass something out of the House, but it's not going to go anywhere after that. And even if we were able to turn 60 votes in the Senate, you know that this president would veto it. So a number of us have taken the very purposeful effort to identify areas that we can work on, get some agreement, in some instances across party line agreement, and move that policy forward. Right now there's legislation that's been introduced on an ag jobs bill that would provide a provision where folks who worked in agriculture for a certain period of time, didn't create any problems, hadn't broken any laws, all that stuff, would be able to legally stay in the country and work towards their green card and their citizenship. I will be reintroducing a bill that I've had had for a couple of years now that would give similar preference to immigrants who serve in our military, for them and their families. It just strikes me when somebody puts on the uniform of our country and puts their life on the line, and then they can't get the help they need for immigration for themselves and their family. That's just wrong to do. I'm the co-author of the Lucille Roybal Aller legislation, the DREAM Act, that would protect the Dreamers who were here, to give them a pathway to citizenship. I think that's very, very important. And to suggest that the Democrats, don't have a policy, well, we've had one for a long time, and it's fixing this mess. And if you recall, back a couple of years ago, we not only had legislation in the Senate, but it passed out of the Senate with bipartisan support, and it came over to the House, and there were ample votes to pass that in the House, but the Republican leadership would not take it up. And if you recall, they stretched it out right up until the days before the last election, and there were a couple of Republican House members who represented minority districts who raised a tissy fit and got them to do something. And the deal was they were supposed to put up their bill, and then they were supposed to put up the bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate. And at the last minute, Speaker Ryan at the time didn't put up the bill that came out of the Senate. He put up two bills that were unacceptable, both of which were voted down in a bipartisan vote. So we've been working on this for quite some time. It's a heavy lift, as you can imagine. Many states don't have big immigrant populations and don't have the same feeling as those of us from California and other sympathetic states. So we're continuing to work on it. I was at the press conference last week where Lucille introduced her DREAM Act, and we had a whole bunch of dreamers there. So we're working it every day. Thank you all very, very much.